Parashat Bo, Ancient Manuscripts. We're going to be looking at just a part of a verse tonight, and we're going to compare Exodus 12:48, just the beginning, which is towards the end of the Torah portion. The Torah portion for Parashat Bo begins at Exodus 10 and goes through halfway through chapter 13. We're towards the end in chapter 12, where the commandment for the Passover is given. We're going to look, as we have been, at the Washington manuscript, and that's what you see on the screen. You can see it's fairly faded and damaged. The other pages we've seen in the past were in much better shape. We're going to specifically zero in this left column here, and it's going to be kind of tough to read, but it's going to be right here, ve, that vav with a shavah, vechi yagur itecha ger ve'asa pesach la'adonai. So it says, and basically this is 12:48, but if a stranger sojourns with you, ki yagur itcha ger. So the word ger is the word translated stranger or foreigner, and the verb yagur, yud gimel vav resh, is from the same root. If a sojourner sojourners with you, the asa pesach la'adonai, and would celebrate, literally would do, asa, pesach la'adonai, Passover unto Adonai. And so sadly, the Washington Pentateuch here is very damaged, but we can make out the letters. What we're going to do is compare that with two manuscript images from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, this manuscript here that we're looking at is, oops, iPad just freaked out here, is not from a scroll of Exodus. It's not from a Torah scroll. It's from a scroll that has passages from a number of different books of the Torah written together. So it's kind of like we don't have the entirety here. We just have this fragment, but it does not come from an actual manuscript of all of Exodus. But what I want to point out here is something that Lois asked about last week, which was the yod and the vav looking really close to each other. So for example, this word right here, I'm going to write in the margin, is vehaya, like that. Vav yod hey, or vav hey yod hey. Right, and this is the phrase from the second half of Exodus 12:48, vehaya ke'ezrach, and he will be like a native. But this is vehaya. But notice here, this letter is a vav, this letter is a yod. So we have a vav and a yod, and boy, don't they look a lot alike. But if you look really close, you'll see that the yod has a little more of an arrow to it, whereas the vav is sharper at the top with a smaller head. The yod is a little bigger, like that. So that's a question that was a really good observation made by Lois. So thanks for that, Lois. What I wanted to look at specifically, though, is some variants here that we see. Well, the Hebrew text, if we compare this with the Washington Pentateuch, what we're going to see, let me move this over here like that. It says, Ki yagur itecha. So Aleph, Tav, right here. So Aleph, Tav, Kaf Sofit, with you, singular. You, and so this Kaf Sofit here with the kamats, that means you, singular. Well, if we look at this particular fragment, all we have is, we have gur here. Maybe if I put it in a yellow, you'll be able to see it a little better on that black background. Here's the gimel. And there's going to be something like a key here. Ki yagur, but notice here we have Aleph, Tav, Kaf, Mem Sofit, and then a Hey. So when I'm following the standard transcription, done here of this verse is, in fact, just what you see here. And I'll write it in the margin here. Ki for Yagur. Now notice this is reconstructed from here. We can, all that is reconstructed. We see Gur et Chema. And there's a mem sofit before the end of the word. And this presumably is a form of et chema, meaning if he dwells with y'all, masculine plural ending. Or what we call a pronominal suffix. Et chema. So the Masoretic text has itcha like that, with a chamatz. So there's a text variant here. Now again, this is not a Torah scroll. The scroll, we have enough fragments to know that it's a collection of verses. It has from Exodus and Deuteronomy mixed in. So we don't know what the function of this particular scroll was, but it does preserve a variant and, of course, this strange situation here of a final mem form in the middle of a word. So, but we're going to shift from that. That was 4Q37, by the way. We're going to look at 4Q136. This one's really cool because the other one was some sort of scroll that had nice big letters to be read. But what we're looking at here is from tefillin or phylactery. So this is tiny, tiny, tiny text that has been unrolled from tefillin. So tefillin is a little box that has little tiny scrolls of specific verses from the Shema and Deuteronomy. So Exodus and Deuteronomy rolled up and put in a little box, and it's worn in prayers on the forehead. So this is called, and on the hand too, this is called tefillin or phylacteries, as it called from the Greek word that we see in Matthew 23. But what's interesting here, so we have this passage from Exodus 12, and what I want to point out is this line that begins, it's hard to see, and I'm depending on the work of the scholars that have gone and transcribed this because they've seen it firsthand under multiple different lights, whereas I'm just using the images that are available online, and they're quite imperfect. But with the transcription, what I'm just going to write over the top here, it's Kaf Yod Aleph. So the key is this, whereas the Masoretic is just Kaf Yod. This is Kaf Yod Aleph, put an Aleph at the end. And then we have Yagur here, Yagur. I'm just going to write them in the margin in kind of block script. And then we see Itchem, Aleph, Tav, Kaf, Mem, Sofit. Remember, the Masoretic text here, if I move over, the Masoretic text here had a Kaf Sofit. You, singular. Whereas Itchem is with y'all, plural. So there's a variant here in this tefillin. Ger is the same. That's this word here. And then it says ve asa. So that's no departure. And he would do Pesach. Now here's one we'll look at. This is Pe, and it looks like a sheen seen, Chet. Then we have our last word here is Le Adonai, Le Yod He Vav He. I'll write that over here too. Okay, so the one thing we're going to notice is this word here. In the Masoretic text, and the standard spelling for Pesach is Pe Samech Chet, with a Samech. But we know that the letter Sin that we see here, if we had a diacritical mark, we'd put a dot on the side. They both make the S sound. So on the right, I have here a Samech. And on the left, we have what's called a Sin. And they both make that sound. And that happens sometimes in the Bible. There's words that are the same words that are spelled sometimes with a Sin, sometimes with a Samech. Maybe someday we'll just look at those examples in the Bible. So the big variance then that we have between this particular, remember this is from a phylactery, or this is from a tefillin, and you see how hard it is to read. I mean, even if you were fluent in Hebrew, you would struggle, like particularly this line right here. Right, there's some real tight lines, and the ink is so blotchy too. You've got a big ink mark that kind of blocks some of the details of the letters. So, but remember, the tefillin were not made to be read, right? The tefillin were not for reading or study. So this was written just for the purpose to have the text, as much text as they could in a tiny little piece of parchment, of prepared leather, and then it would be rolled up really, really tightly and put in a bundle, put in this little box that would be worn in certain prayers. So this was never to be taken out and unrolled, read, rolled back up. So some important things. So one, tefillin were not for reading or study. Presumably, the user or wearer of the tefillin knew what text was inside. And this is another interesting point on this, is that some of the tefillin from the Dead Sea Scrolls is different than the later rabbinic in one key way. Dead Sea Scrolls tefillin had the 10 words, what we know as the 10 commandments. So in a kosher tefillin today, you would not have the 10 words be part of the tefillin. But back here, we know that from the first century, there were at least some Jewish groups who did have tefillin, but they were not they were not Pharisees, and they had the 10 words as part of it. So remember that the idea is attaching yourself to God's word, binding them to you, just like it says in the Proverbs. Bind the commandments as a necklace, right, as around your neck and on your forehead, right? So the idea is you hold it very close to you, guarding your heart with words that are not your words, but they're words from God. And so what we see here then tonight, we've seen this fragment from the tefillin, and how in this particular line that we looked at from Exodus 12 verse 48, that we had some variants where the Masoretic text says, if a ger resides with you, singular, that's what we see here, with you, singular, whereas this says with y'all, plural. And he would do the Pesach. We see that at the Qumran, it's an unconventional spelling for Pesach. It means Pesach, so the meaning has not changed here. It still means Pesach, but the Samech was not used. Instead, it was the Sin. There was one other point that I wanted to make, is this Aleph here. That's also additional. The Masoretic text here just has kaf yod, ki. So what you see here is text variation. These, on this little verse here, we see these three specific points that show a divergence. It's not big. It's a tiny little divergence, but it shows that there was looser scribal tradition. And it seems that the further away you get from Jerusalem, the texts that you find are a little more variant. That's not always true, but the sense is that what the rabbis later talk about, that there was a time where when the temple was standing, that official texts were kept by the master scribes near the temple or at the temple, and that people who had manuscripts outside, they might have had a Torah scroll or a scroll of a certain book of the prophets, they could bring it and have a master scribe go through and check their manuscripts from what was kept at the temple. And as we've seen in previous weeks, there's times where we find these fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls that vary quite a bit in spelling and other things, that there's a little drift away from that more exacting discipline that we find that is ultimately encoded in what we see in the big text here. This is from our Washington Pentateuch. Ki yagur itcha ger ve'asa pesach la'Adonai. If a stranger dwells among you and would do the Passover unto the Lord. And then it goes on and tells what he has to do. You have to be all in, right? The commandment is to love him with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. So I just wanted to do my little ancient manuscript bit here tonight and have this recorded for those who are interested. We looked at Exodus 12:48, just the first part, comparing two different fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. One from a scroll that had a collection of verses from Deuteronomy and Exodus, not a proper Torah scroll, and the other was this little tiny fragment from a tefillin, and they both had variants from what we see later in the Masoretic text. All right, hope you all have a Shabbat Shalom.